So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeanette Whitten. I'm the director of the herbarium that's part of the museum here. And I'm very pleased today to introduce Professor James Dickson from the University of Glasgow. Professor Dickson is now an emeritus professor at Glasgow, where he spent his academic career with the title of Professor of Archaeobotany, which is a wonderful descriptor for the study of plant remains associated with humans in some way. In particular, he's analyzed been affiliated with the analysis of some rather famous finds, in particular finds of human remains associated with melting glaciers. And I'm sure we'll hear a great deal more about these today. In each case, his analysis of plant remains, and especially one of our favorite little groups of organisms, the Sphagnum mosses, has provided a wealth of insights into the lifestyle of the people, of these ancient people. His research is published in all kinds of standard, high-profile, peer-reviewed literature, in addition to being picked up by the popular press and by popular media, documentaries, and stories on Discovery Channel and Nova and various other places. And as I'm sure he will highlight for you today, there's also a brand new book, or brand new in book terms in the last few months, that summarizes some of his career-long research. So nothing further, I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I was amused that you mentioned what goes on in the media, radio, television, and the press. And it's all the nonsense that you get in the media that in large measure motivated this book, because there's far too much sensationalism and speculation on far too little data. The Tyrolean Iceman, the guy from the Alps, was a sensation, justifiably so. And it stayed a sensation because every few years there seems to be some new discovery. Like you may remember 10 years ago, it was realised that there was an arrowhead in his back, so he had been shot in the back. And there's no doubt at all that that is what killed him. So we'll say a little bit more about that partway through the lecture. And you'll notice there's another name on there. This is Professor Klaus Ӧtzi in the University of Innsbruck in Austria, who is my great pal, collaborate, and indeed it was he and his boss in 1994 that brought me into this project, which has kept me happily engaged ever since. And although I'm 10 years retired, I still look down a microscope occasionally, and you will hear our latest kind of mini eureka moment about the Iceman. And you notice the title up there says Bogmosses in Ancient Ice Mummies, and it's, there are 3 or 4 cases I'm going to describe to you, and there may be bogmosses around them sticking to the clothes, but what fascinates me is how do they get into their innards, and why are they there? So, well, mosses are on the home small plants, and they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. There you see just 4 examples. Actually, all 4 of them were found with the Iceman. And this one down here at the bottom left, there are 5 or 6 gut samples from the Iceman, and that moss is in every one of them, which is intriguing. That's not a bog moss. I'm going to show you bog mosses in a minute. The top right is a very common moss. You see it here in the forest. It goes right round the circumboreal zone. It's called Hylocomium splendens, and that was sticking to the Iceman's clothes, and there was a tiny fragment sticking to the robe of long ago person found, whom you're also going to hear about. That's the first ever ancient glacier mummy from North America. So, just to give you an idea what a variety of mosses look like. But bog mosses don't look like that. Now, where does all this start? Well, I was an undergraduate at Glasgow, then I went off to Cambridge, and I was studying there the kind of what you might call the Ice Age history of the mosses. And here was a very early part of that. This is a Bronze Age grave in Fife, eastern Scotland. It's a young man. He's in a crisp grave that's crouched up, and you see out the black material there. Well, in that black material, which may have been the remains of a shroud, there's a bogmoss. So I've known for a long time that prehistoric people had an interest in bogmosses. For those of you who like drinking alcohol, there's a beaker there, and that's important in the archaeological history of Britain as a whole, because it's my work by looking inside that beaker which strongly suggests that it had been full of either mead or ale. Some archaeologists had long thought that beakers were for drinking out of, but for Britain, this was the first time that there was scientific evidence for the presence of alcohol. It's an ongoing controversy. There are now many more examples of that from Scotland. There's one from Wales. For some reason, there isn't any from England, although there are some from Denmark and there are some from southern Germany. And the crucial plant is meadowsweet. I think you folks call it the queen of the meadows. There's a lot of pollen in the bottom. Anyway, that's a whole separate talk. Perhaps you'd prefer that to hearing about the gut contents. So that's the early 1960s. I turned up in Cambridge in October 1959. Now, you see, there are 4 bog mosses. They don't look at all like the mosses you've just very recently seen. They come in a variety of sizes, colours. There's a fundamental ground plan. They may look rather different, but they all have exactly the same structure, which is in fact unique in the plant kingdom. There's no other plant that has exactly the structure, the mode of branching. There's no other plant that you see on the left-hand side, these little spheres are the spore-producing organs. It's a very, very distinctive group of plants, not closely related to any of the other mosses. And you, top right, that is probably the very one that we first found in the Iceman. The one at the bottom right was found with him. May well have been sticking to his clothes. The one at the top left is the kind of moss that was found inside a long-ago person found. So you've got the message that mosses are very distinctive. Bog mosses are, and there's just a kind of summary of that. I mentioned the way the mode of branching, the capsules and the spores, and the detailed microscopic structure of the leaves. Now, I'm sure you realise from the common name that bog mosses like to grow in bogs, and they can grow in great masses, great lawns, and right round the cooler parts of the northern hemisphere, they are important peat forms. So when you buy peat and sprinkle it on your garden, a lot of it is bogmoss. They're great masses of peat in non-tropical areas. There's peat in tropical areas too, but it's different. We won't go into that. So, and there's a close-up. The leaves are quite small, and you may realise already that the cell pattern looks very distinctive. If you look at the top right, you see there are long narrow cells that are green, and they are the kind of photosynthetic cells that gets the plant its energy. and then there are big, broader, empty-looking cells, and indeed the cells are empty. Their function is simply to hold water. So, vein cells and highline cells, no other moss has a cell structure like that. So, enough of that. Well, there's a famous site on the east coast of west coast of Greenland, near Disco Island, which was walked on way back in the 80s, and many of you may recall that heart-rending little mummy as a baby. And a whole group of people, women, half a dozen women or so, and a baby and a boy, and they were living around 1475 AD. And in the feces of the one woman that was examined in this way, she found fragments of at least 6 mosses, including a bogmoss. And we'll pass on to this quickly. Mosses don't have common names, or if they do, they're modern concoctions. There is a list. We're not going to go through them all in detail, you'll be thankful. But you see Sphagnum spit or Sphagnum spit, which means they think they found one sphagnum, or maybe it was more than one sphagnum. Well, you should be able to do better than that. But what concerns us is their assessment of this. Because of the many fragments of crowberry, mountain foxtail, and various mosses, it is assumed that these plants were part of the food. Well, I mean, that is wrong. It's simply, their assumption is wrong. Nobody eats moss for very good reasons. It won't poison you, but it's not nutritious and it's not palatable. And indeed, there are very sparse records from across the world of people eating moss, even bog moss. But it's usually a kind of starvation food. And indeed that may be the answer for these poor souls in Western Greenland, that they were indeed starving to death, and so that they had been ingesting the moss. But as a general rule, nobody eats moss. You know, people eat ferns, they eat fungi, they eat conifers, they eat flowering plants, of course, they eat seaweeds. And the one big exception to all that are mosses or bryophytes, that's the same mosses, and liverworts. People don't eat them. Now, if there were First Nations that were sitting in the back of the audience, this has happened to me several times, they all jump up and down and say, we eat moss, and I say, no you don't, because they don't distinguish between moss and lichen. And it's lichen that they like to eat, such as reindeer moss, which is not a moss, it's a lichen. And they're very fond of getting their caribou and hoping that the stomach is richly full of lichens, and they let it calm down or become mature over a few weeks, and then they take out the lichen and consume that. It's something of a delicacy. And it's very likely that there are little bits of moss proper scattered amongst the lichen, but they are not deliberately eating the moss, they are eating the lichen, already partly digested by the caribou. So, there is one example and my thoughts about it. I mean, in that area there would be sphagnum in the tundra. And so, you know, the fragments, see, there's no information about how many fragments. I mean, it literally just says that, leaves of sphagnums. So, you might argue that it's a purely accidental occurrence. But then so would the other mosses be as well. Right, so much for the unfortunate Greenlanders from the late 15th century. Now we're coming a bit nearer, indeed we're in British Columbia now. I had started working on the Tyrolean Iceman before KDT, that's the short for his Southern Tachoni name, Kawadate Duns and Chi, I had been working on that several years before KDT was discovered, which was on the 14th of August 1999. And there is the, you see the site up near the top left-hand corner. And that triangle sticking down, that's the Haynes Triangle, and of course it's actually British Columbia, it's not Alaska, not the Yukon, to the north. Well, I haven't got time to go into all the details of the science that I was involved in, especially also with Dr. Ӧtzi, a Canadian, in the Canadian Geological Survey. And then there was also Richard Hebda, who was the botanist in the Royal BC Museum in Victoria. So there was three of us sitting about this. And I mean, I was the guy in the pole position. And we now know for sure, really, that long person found set off on his last journey from the coast, from somewhere between Taylor Bay on the left there, the Icy Strait, and some possibly far up the Lynn Canal, and maybe as far as Clockman. But Clockman is getting far from the sea, and that's important. I'm coming back to tell you why that is important. There's one, Al Hardy's in the front there, and there is possibly the most wonderful picture of me I think I've ever had taken. It's just at the just above the site where long ago person found is down to the right, and that's me in the foreground. There's the helicopter, and there's somebody else crossing that snowfield there. And I'm fond of showing this because the amazing thing is, at the very moment that the Iceman was discovered on the 14th of August 1999, I was only 50 miles away, and ever since I felt somebody was trying to tell me something. I had been giving a couple of lectures on the small cruise liner Universe Explorer, and the day before, you may be amused to hear, I actually said to the audience in response to a question, there'll never be another Iceman. But you'll understand more about that because I was really referring to the Tyrolean Iceman, and I stick to that. I don't think that really the chances of another Tyrolean Iceman turning up from over 5,000 years ago are pretty remote. KDT is only 200 or 300 years old, much more recent than the Tyrolean guy. And there is Bill Hanlon, who did that. He discovered KDT, and that dark mass at his feet is the human remains. There are body parts, of course, and indeed I had the one and only time I've ever been at an autopsy. I don't suppose that'll happen again. Like most glacier mummies, KDT was smashed into pieces. He had lost his right leg and his right arm, and the head wasn't found at the time. His hair was found, but not the head. And this is Bill Hanlon, who lives in Sparwood, almost in Alberta. He was out there hunting dull sheep with two pals, and they found this, and they had the good sense to act in the appropriate ways. And soon after, the body was excavated, and there have been detailed studies, but not as detailed as there could have been. For one thing, the agreement was that the body would be cremated, and indeed it was cremated in a Victorian crematorium. So there cannot be ongoing studies. 3 years later, this skull was found by this very same guy. They were up hunting that territory once again, and they thought we'd go and see if we can find anything more, and we found the skull in 3 pieces. The skull has not not been studied in any detail at all and will not be so, sadly. You'll gather I get exasperated by the restrictions that First Nations put on these studies if they agree to the science. In the first place, they should allow the science to go off at full cock, not half cock, because we would learn a great deal from the skull, particularly the teeth, if they were ever studied. The skull was put inside, or the pieces of the skull were put in the small commemorative cairn at the site. And that's as I first saw it in 2002, the arrows pointing to the place. You see the helicopter below the arrow there, and you see there's a lot of ice and snow. And I was back 3 years later. But I was back 3 years later, almost all that ice was gone. I mean, this is the story of glaciers. The world over, of course, they are all in retreat. Well, there's a nice big chunk of bogmoss. I can't do better than that in this case. Well, it's section cutifolia, but I can't tell you the species because you can't do it from such a piece as that. So that was from his sort of rectum. So why is that there? Well, that part of the world is not where he was found, but where he came from is a very boggy place. You know, the panhandle of Alaska and the adjacent bit of British Columbia gets a prodigious rainfall, and it's really quite mild. So there are very large boggy areas. So you might say, all right, he set off on his last journey, and bits of bogmoss were sticking to his, I was about to say shoes, except that he didn't have shoes, sticking to his robe. But you've got to get it into his intestines. I mean, this is why it's interesting that they're inside. Doesn't really matter greatly if they're on clothing or whatever, but why are they inside? Well, some of you may well know that bogmosses are not just very absorbent, they are actually antiseptic. Accordingly, they have been used as wound dressings, certainly as late as the Second World War, even more so in the First World War, and it's a very sensible thing. They are highly absorbent and they actually stop bacterial growth. So it's a very good thing to use as wound dressing, and incidentally the First Nations are only too familiar with bogmosses as diapers. And First Nations babies don't get nappy rash because their nappies are made of bogmoss. So why is it there? Well, I don't really know is the answer to that. Could this be a fragment of a wound dressing? Now, the pieces of the body that I saw, the torso and the left arm and the left leg, the torso was split through the middle, right across here, so there was a kind of hip part and an upper part. There was no sign of foul play. You couldn't see cuts. You couldn't see broken what? I mean, there were bones that had been broken by the ice, but there was no suggestion of foul play. And indeed, how he came to die is somewhat mysterious. There may not have been a crevasse for him to fall down. That kind of small glacier, because it is small, tend not to be crevassed. But somehow he died on the ice and got entombed. There was 2 or 3 meters of ice below him, and at least the same above him. So he was in the ice. That's why he's in pieces. Because the ice moves, your foot quickly becomes frozen stiff, and when the ice moves, you get broken. That's why his head had been detached. I was I lectured about this in Whitehorse several years ago, and I may say there would be between 250 and 300 people in the audience, so it's a bit of a contrast to today. But there was a Qilakitsoq, that's the coastal Indians. There was a Qilakitsoq in the audience, and he came up to me afterwards and said, do you know that if it's inconvenient for us to take back the whole body of a colleague who's died, we would take the head off and take that. And that was before it was common knowledge that the skull had been found. And indeed, the Champagne Aishak Indians don't want you to know that the skull has been found. Although it was in the Vancouver Sun briefly. And if you read my book, it's in my book. And I've not often shown that picture of the skull either. So, and I'm going to say something that I've never said in public before. Long ago, a person found was not a Champagne Aishak Indian. He was a Qilakitsoq. The science points to that really quite unequivocally. He was certainly coastal. He didn't live in the interior. He was coastal, and the plants sticking to his robe, the plants and animal remains in his gut point that way. The stable isotope chemistry in his bones. He had a diet over 90% marine diet, marine mammals and marine fish. And incidentally, that sort of thing was implied at the very outset because he was wearing a Qilakitsoq hat. Coastal people didn't wear hats like that. And he had a ground squirrel robe. This is all a bit of a digression, but I mean, I feel so strongly about it because I actually heard a senior Qilakitsoq on Friday afternoon in the new cultural centre where the Champagne Aishaks get up and say, categorically, long ago person found what a Qilakitsoq, and that's absolutely right. And that's been kind of hushed up, the Champagne Aishaks don't want you to know that, but that's a fact. And it all points that way. His last journey was from the coast to the interior. It needs a lot longer to go into all that detail. So we have something of a puzzle here. Why is that there? Yeah, I know why. I was telling you about the autopsy. There's no sign of foul play. However, the whole body has never been found, and in some cases there are just bones. So it's conceivable that he had a flesh wound, and he had used bogmoss as a wound dressing. And it was sticking to his fingers, and somehow, when he sat down to eat, little bits and pieces got into his gut. Well, that's a plausible story. I can't prove it to you. There's better information along these lines from what I'm now going to move on to. Sorry, I'm not quite. One of the places that we thought he might have lived was Yakutat, which is a wonderful place on the coast of Alaska. The city and borough of Yakutat with 600 inhabitants. I was teasing them about that because, of course, in Britain you can't be a city without a charter from the monarch, preferably a cathedral, but they think they are a city. So, and that's the bogmoss, you see. The whole place is sodden wet, the trees are dripping with epiphytes, and indeed on my second visit there, the day before there had been 10 inches of rain, so you'll understand why there are a lot of mosses there. Mosses like it wet and cool. Well now, you can read all about that, and this is my recent book which you see there. And this leads us on to Ӧtzi, the Tyrolean Iceman. It's now 21 years since he was discovered. And this is a new reconstruction for the Iceman Museum. Some of you may have seen Ӧtzi. You go to the appropriate museum and you can meet him. He's lying on his back in his birthday suit in a little cold room, and millions of people have seen him. And there is the most recent reconstruction. He had a lot more clothes than that, which I'm not going to go into in any detail. He was about 46. He lived with absolute certainty unless you're going to attack the whole basis of radiocarbon dating. He lived with absolute certainty something like 5,200 to 300 years ago. There's a lot that's controversial about Ӧtzi, but the carbon dates are not controversial. So he lived a long time ago. And it's wonderful because he is the best preserved, the oldest, best preserved human corpse. And he's got a full set of clothes and a full set of gear. It's just absolutely fantastic, beyond anybody's wildest dreams. You know, royal Egyptian mummies like Tutankhamun, what the hell, you know, you expect them, you go out looking for them, you don't go out looking for Ӧtzi. Totally unexpected, it was a real sensation. Oh, I'll give you one criticism of that. He was used to be in the hills. And indeed, there's a good American paper in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology that worked out his weight by two different methods, and they got the same result. He was not very tall, as you can see, but he was 61 kilograms in live weight. And they're explicit in the paper by looking at the structure of his bones and musculature that he was a sturdy guy. And the likelihood is that he was very used to running up and down the Alpine zone in just south of the Austrian modern border. So if you accept that, you might think that his thick fingers and farmer-like hands are entirely appropriate. But in fact, the medics that have studied his fingers with CT scans and X-rays and so on, they say that he had rather delicate fingers. And they don't look delicate there. That's because the guys who reconstructed him hadn't been told that. And they just assumed that what they knew, they assumed he was a hunter or something like that, and therefore he would have coarse fingers. So I don't quite understand how you can square it. If he's got big, sturdy, strong legs, I mean, why has he got delicate fingers? But you might think of an answer to that. And there is the very place at 3,210 metres above sea level. That's 10,500 feet. You see the monument there on the right-hand picture, and that, of course, there's me on the right, and that diminutive French life on the left, and that is the very place where the body, the very spot where the body melted out of the ice. Now, of course, there's a very great deal that I can tell you about Ӧtzi. Two different bogmosses. Sorry, no longer two, it's 3 different bogmosses were found with Ӧtzi. That's his name, Ӧtzi. This one was outside him. You see, it was found from string grass hair and fibres. Some of you may recall that the body was recovered in the most ghastly, rough way because it wasn't realised at the time that it was such an ancient corpse. It was just assumed to be a modern mountaineering accident. And the forensic team that came up just kind of, really, they just ripped him sort of from the ice. Whereas if it had been a proper archaeological excavation, it would be a different story. Well, this bog moss, I should say, no bog moss grows at very high altitude. Nowhere. Not the Alps, not the St. Elias Mountains, not the Andes, not the Himalayas. They are not high altitude plants. Some of them go to high latitude, but they do not go to high altitudes. And in the Alps, the highest is about 2,300 metres, whereas Ӧtzi is at 3,200 metres. But we know of that one quite near the site on the map, not on the grid. On the map, it's only about 5 kilometres away. And it grows in little marshy areas. So, you know, I don't think you need to look for any very elaborate explanation, and that might just be an accidental occurrence, that was sticking to his shoes. He had elaborate shoes and he had leggings, as you saw. But the next one, and this is the really exciting thing about bogmosses in the ancient ice mummies. Here we are. Now you've seen that picture top right before, but you've not seen the one on the left before. Now that may look like absolutely nothing on earth to you, but it says instantly to me, I am Sphagnum imbricatum sensulato. And on further reflection, it could well be the aphany, subspecies aphany. So, and that's only about 30 cells, and it's about 200 microns along the long axis. So it's a small fragment of a leaf. And it's from his colon, the far end of the colon, where the descending colon is becoming the sigmoid colon just before the rectum. So, it's in his colon. Now, to me, the outstanding interest as a biologist from all these ice mummies, certainly long ago person found and Ӧtzi, is this. You've got in their innards a history and a map. They're encoded maps and diaries, and the tricks are to break the codes. And we've broken some of these codes. So, look at his hand there. That's his right hand, and the arrow is pointing to a cut in here. And the cut is so bad it goes down to the bone, and it goes right across the palm. We learned the other night, Wednesday night, in Whitehorse, because the director of the Iceman Museum was there, that there's also a cut down here, right to the bone. And I didn't know about that. You won't find it in my books. I knew about this. And this cut is so bad that according to the medics in Botanical, he couldn't have been able to clutch his hand without pain. So he had difficulties in doing that. This leads on to another enigma, to my way of thinking. You know, he had a longbow, a quiver full of arrows, an axe, a hafted axe, 2 birchbark buckets, and sundry other objects. So, if he had one hand that couldn't be used, how did he carry all that stuff? Because most people think he was fleeing up the hills to escape his enemies. Well, I mean, strictly speaking, there is no scientific evidence for that. It's speculation. Although we know, I'm telling you about encoded maps and diaries, we know from the pollen in his stomach, the pollen in his ileum, that's the small intestine, the 3 samples from his colon and the 1 from the rectum, that his last 36 hours, 48 hours perhaps, were hectic. The story begins with the rectum, of course, because that was the oldest food that we've got. And the pollen analysis of that puts him high in the mountains. So the story begins, he is already high in the mountains, probably somewhat above the tree line. And then you go down into his colon, in the middle part of his colon, the pollen tells you something quite different. He was low down, and quite possibly less than 1,000 meters. And then you come a bit higher up, of course, and the body was finally found at 3,210 meters. So you've got 36 hours, 2 days, and he's apparently doing this. We don't know why he was up in there in the first place, although you can put forward sensible ideas, and we don't know why he came down and went back up again. So that's what one means by saying there's a diary. There's also geographical regions of the plants in his gut about where he went up, so hence the map. But I better not go into that. I've still got time, haven't I? Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Right. Okay. So we're talking about this before I go on to anything else. So this bit of bogmoss is in the lower part of his colon. So perhaps he swallowed that at an early stage, where, maybe a day before his death. And the interesting thing is that the medics have studied this cut, and it had begun to heal. So they say that this fight had taken place, half a day or a day and a half or 2 days before he was finally killed. So what I say is, he's got this badly cut right hand. He knows about the properties of bogmoss. Presumably with his left hand, rather than his badly injured right hand, he picks up some bogmoss at low altitude, not high the hill, at low altitude. He squeezes the water out and then he uses it to staunch his right hand. So his right hand is covered in blood, but he's got bogmoss in there, and inevitably little bits of bogmoss are sticking to his fingers. And some pieces, or maybe only the one piece that we were fortunate enough to find, got into his gut when he had a snack or a meal. And I'm sort of coming on to that final because of the very interesting, exciting information about his very demise. And it involves his full stomach. So, that's my plausible proof, plausible explanation. That little bit of bogmoss was part of a wind dressing. Well, that's a quotation from near the end of my book. And you see, I say, this is because, I put that in because his stomach proper, the first major digestive organ, Central Europeans call it gaster, and I wish we called it gaster too, because if you say, oh, I've got a pain in my stomach, it's probably not in your stomach in the strict sense at all, it's in some other abdominal organ. So we're talking about the stomach in the strict sense. And it was announced at a conference a couple of years ago, but not published, just like that, out of the blue. His stomach is full. And prior to that, we had all sort of thought the stomach probably empty. So here we get radiographic evidence that the stomach is full. And indeed, we saw better evidence in Whitehorse the other evening. Now, you might say that changes everything. The stomach is full. Well, if you've got an empty stomach and you start eating, the first food that you've taken in begins to leave the stomach in about 20 minutes. So if the stomach is full, there is the implication that he was shot in the back while he was still eating, or at any rate soon after. I mean, I'm not really sure what the medics mean when they say the stomach is full. But there was a lot of food in his stomach. So he's shot in the back either during his very last meal or sometimes shortly afterwards that he had eaten. And of course that throws in doubt the whole idea of he's being chased up the mountains by enemies. Or maybe he thought he had escaped his enemies and he hid behind a rock and he fed himself a hearty last meal. But that is quite unexpected and interesting recent discovery. And all that was not known when I was writing my book, but I put in that sentence, let there be meat, cereals and other plants, sloes perhaps, the omnivorous Iceman, let there be flat neckera and bogmoss too. Well, there is bogmoss, and there it is. This is the last, my mini eureka moment last October. This is a sphagnum. You can see the empty hyaline cells, you can see the dark cells with their chlorophyll at all. That is a bogmoss. It's not the same bogmoss as was in his colon, but I can be certain of the genus. Nobody in the world can be certain what species of sphagnum that is. So there are 3 bogmosses with Ӧtzi. There's the one found outside him, there's the one from his colon, and there's the one from his stomach. So is the one from his stomach, is it the same explanation as I have already given, or not? Is there some other explanation possible? The answer to that is, of course, yes, but I don't know that we'll be able to say what alternative explanation there might be. So, there was a controversy about Ӧtzi way back in the year 2000. This was one of the most surprising things I've ever read in my long scientific career, because this was published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, which, you know, the society thinks of itself as very distinguished in their journals. The journal goes back to the late 17th century, and they published this statement, which is complete nonsense, that Ӧtzi, wait for it, had an essentially vegan diet. Now, I'm sure you don't need to tell you what a vegan is, an extreme sort of vegetarian. Well, before this was published, Klaus Ugel and I had seen meat fibres in his colon from the pollen slides. So if the guy was a vegan, he gave up his principles in the last couple of days of his life. In any case, it's absolute balderdash. Who, you know, to be a vegan is a lifestyle choice. It's a kind of philosophical, religious type of thing. Who has ever claimed that a prehistoric guy could be a vegan? And incidentally, it's stable isotope evidence, you know. Anyway, I couldn't stand this, and I gathered some stable isotope chemists and others around me, and we published a rebuttal in the same journal. Ӧtzi was not a vegan. You can be quite sure of that. And indeed, we soon after DNA analysis of the colon in upper samples showed that he'd been eating red deer. It's roughly what you folks call elk, which is very confusing because what we call elk, you call moose. There we are, we'll skip over that. He'd been eating red deer and alpine ibex, which I can recommend to you. I had a lunch of alpine ibex last October, never having thought that I would ever manage to eat it, because this is a creature, it's a big wild species of goat with enormous curved ribbed horns, and it was almost exterminated in Europe. And indeed, there was only a small colony left in the Apennines at the royal estate, you know, owned by the Italian king. And from there, it has been reintroduced in all sorts of places in the Alps. And around Innsbruck, there are now so many that it gets culled. So if you're lucky, you can go into a restaurant and you can eat it, and it is good to eat. So he had been eating alpine ibex, and that makes up the bulk of his full stomach. But it's not alone. And there's a list of the things, some of the things that the study still goes on, that we have found in his stomach. And this is mostly Klaus Ugel. The great bulk is alpine ibex meat. And that's no surprise, because we know it was lower down the gut. And indeed, when the body was first found, there were some splinters of bone that were identified as alpine ibex beside him. The cereal bran, that's no surprise, because the cereal bran, just like all bran, in every gut sample. It's made of einkorn, which is the most primitive wheat. And there's sparse pollen. You wouldn't expect there to be a lot of pollen in the stomach. The pollen gets, as the digestive process goes on, of course the stuff gets more and more concentrated, and so the pollen gets more concentrated. So counting the pollen, identifying the pollen from the feces and the colon contents and so on was quite easy, but the pollen in the stomach proper is sparse. And here's the first rather funny thing. There are spores and sporangia of bracken, Pteridium aquilinum, and that is a surprise, and it's not obvious to Google or eye why it's there, and indeed it's in every gut sample. From its abundance in the vegetation of Tyrol, you wouldn't really think it would be in every gut sample. So we're scratching around thinking that there's some special reason that he had made an infusion, and we know he had intestinal worms, and it might have been a medicine to try and get rid of the whipworms that could have caused blockages of his gut. But that is up for consideration. And then there's a complete unchewed leaf of European spruce. Why anybody has a complete leaf of that in the gut is hard to say. I mean, they're not palatable, they're even a bit kind of pointy, stiff. So that's a surprise. There's a tiny fragment of bogmoss that you've seen. Well, I thought there might be in the stomach. Predicted that, but again, we don't really know why. There are rhizopods. These are little amoeba-like creatures that live amongst sphagnum. So the sphagnum and the rhizopods back each other up. And there's charcoal particles, small. No surprise. I mean, almost all of these well-preserved ancient human bodies, they're cooking over open fire, and there are little particles of charcoal flying around, and of course they may be roasting the meat on a spit and so on. So, I mean, charcoal is no surprise. Indeed, Ӧtzi's lungs were partially blackened from anthracnosis. And there's a neat little barkfly, which just a couple of millimeters, and presumably that is just an accidental ingestion. Well, I mean, we're coming now near to the end of our story here. You will see, I hope, why these anciently frozen bodies are quite fascinating. And they say that the outline of the last hours of Ӧtzi and the outline of the last hours of long-ago person found, and the breaking of the codes in various ways from the botany and zoology, and stable isotopes of the teeth. In the case of Ӧtzi, by looking at the teeth and bones, and even the contents of the gut, it's really proven that as a boy, Ӧtzi lived in one place, and then as a man, he lived in another. So that when he was growing up, he was a little bit to the south of east of the site where he was found, and as a man, he lived more or less due south. These places are not too far apart. I mean, maybe I haven't given stable isotopes enough credit, because that's an interesting part of the story, that he was a boy in one place and an adult in another. But these two studies, starting off with Ӧtzi and then moving on to sort of KDT, there's marine organisms through KDT's gut. There's beach asparagus in his gaster, his stomach, and there are little bits of it that are through the gut. In the stomach, there is also a bit of the internal skeleton of kind of flexible bits that stick between your teeth a lobster or a crab. There's a little bit of that. Lower down the gut there is a sea urchin spicule. I may say I was looking for both seaweeds, which the Qilakitzok are very fond of eating. Indeed, they traded them inland in special boxes. And I was also looking for bits of lichen. I found neither. Not to say they're not there, it's only to say I didn't find them. So, these two studies, I could go on and on and on, of course, but this kind of an intestinal analysis linked to stable isotopes and minerals in the gut, which I've only mentioned now, you can build up these very detailed stories. And both these studies are unique in archaeological science. There's nothing else like them. I mean, people have analysed human coprolites, but these are not inside the body, being deposited and mineralised or so whatever. The great fun is to get hold of an ancient glacier mummy and hope you've got ingesta all the way from the stomach to the rectum. With that, I'll take questions.